Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Excellent.
Yes.
I once attended a KPMG presentation in which they were encouraging business leaders to treat information as an asset. They were arguing that business decisions are made based on information, and therefore that data should be treated as critical. And of course, the amount of information that businesses source, store, process, and generate themselves is vast and increasing exponentially every year. And of course, we believe that information is the lifeblood of any organization. So then why don't some businesses manage information as other assets? So we see some common reasons. So first of all, although the size of the overall spend can be substantial, the value of individual orders in subscriptions and memberships can be fairly low, so below the threshold required for approval, any type of approval. Then we have the size of the visible spend, which can be too low to warrant or to prioritize the project from a procurement standpoint. Then procurement often classed the spend as non-critical. The suppliers as low-value, non-strategic. But the reason that we see more often than not is it's the status quo. It's the way that we've always done it. So a classic case of using an axe to cut a tree down rather than investing in a chainsaw to get the job done in half the time. And yet there's a trend that's been emerging for the last 5 years or so, one of digitization and one of procurement wanting to capture the entire spend. And it's something that's been picking up a lot of pace. But the question that we get asked more frequently is how, if there is appetite to capture this spend, how can it be captured in a way that is fast and simple and doesn't cause a distraction for the team? And so we wanted the opportunity to kind of explain a recent project, one with SAP. We started working with them about 1.5 years ago. So obviously a big thank you to SAP for allowing us to talk about the project. But the idea is to answer this question and to try and provide a bit of information. We'll talk about the process, of course the requirements, and ultimately the benefits as well. So just first of all, a few introductions. No introductions needed for SAP. Obviously a complex organization, a market leader, a network of offices across 130 or so countries. Prenax, on the other hand, is lesser known, so we're more niche. We're historically have always had a much lower profile than many of the other businesses that are here today. But as a very brief introduction, we are the world's only global corporate specialist in this space. We started off life in Sweden, in the Nordics, about 30 years ago. We've grown in that time, both organically and through a series of acquisitions. So we now have a network of, I think, about 12 offices globally. So we're in the US and APAC and across Europe. We have about 5,000 customers globally, and our turnover is about 250 million euros. I also need to introduce Schweitzer, because Schweitzer is our partner in Germany. So they look after the German markets, namely Switzerland, Austria, and Germany. We forged this commercial partnership with them a number of years ago in order to provide a global solution for our global customers jointly. And this is exactly what we did for SAP. So with SAP, we signed a joint contract, and the idea is that we work together to provide global consolidated reporting and service and so on and so forth. But just very briefly about Schweitzer, they're very well established, having launched in the 19th century. They have 32 offices globally, 600 staff, and a very similar size to Prenax in terms of turnover as well. So what is the category that we're talking about here today? In a nutshell, it's information resources. So we're talking print and digital subscriptions. This includes the multi-user licenses, so the tail-end services in market data, professional personal memberships, corporate memberships, books, and loose leaves. And this category is very different from others. So for example, with IT, there'll be fixed pricing, whereas with information resources, the prices are very fluid, very dynamic. you could have two departments buying exactly the same thing and paying very different prices. And of course, the picture is quite fragmented as well. So a very, very complex picture, but that does mean that there are a lot of potential synergies as well by just capturing it all. So here we have, Here we have some examples of some of the publishers that we work with. So the complete list is very extensive, so thousands of suppliers, supply connections, but basically anything from your everyday newspaper all the way through to Bloomberg. And then we have the same again for memberships, as I said, professional memberships as well as corporate membership, and an extensive list of suppliers that we consolidate for SAP and other customers as well. So an important part of the project for SAP was sustainability, and there are 3 pillars that we help with. First of all, we have compliance. So in this context, it's all about copyright compliance. It's understanding the supplier's terms and conditions. It's making sure that end users are aware of what those limitations are and mitigating against the risk of reputational and financial damage. Then we have financials, so that's having visibility and control over the spend. It's making sure the business only spends money on what it needs, and it's having the ability to cancel spend and orders for things that are no longer required as well. And then lastly, the environmental impact as well, so reducing the carbon footprint, reliance on print, and of course scope 3, so having clarity of the supply chain in its entirety. So providing a bit of context, setting the scene, when we talk to an organization for the first time, we're usually told that they don't have many subscriptions, they don't have many memberships, and that's a misconception in some cases. This is the picture that we're looking at more often than not. So the very tip of the iceberg is the visible spend. It's the amount of spend that they can see, that they can report on. Underneath or below the waterline is everything else, and that's mainly made up of expense claims that have been misclassified. It's made up of P-card payments, spend that doesn't require approval because it's below that threshold. And herein lies the problem for procurement. How can procurement streamline payment, suppliers, and orders if they can't see them? This is the result. So a lot of payments, a lot of expense claims, a lot of suppliers, a lot of admin. And the ultimate result is a lot of wastage, both in terms of time and money for the organization. So starting at the beginning, the requirements set by SAP. So of course, they were very particular. They wanted to do business with a provider that had a global network and a global supply chain, someone who could standardize processes right across the board globally. Someone who could manage memberships as well as licenses and subscriptions. They needed an intuitive system because the customer experience was crucial to them. Of course, integrated systems through SAP Ariba eProcurement. Detailed reporting goes without saying, and then a process to manage renewals in an automated fashion, personal service in every country, and of course, digital transformation. And when we talk about digital transformation in our world, it comes in 2 halves. We have, first of all, process, so streamlining, automating, and integrating. And then, of course, we have content, print, converting that to digital wherever possible. So now we can start talking about the implementation phase. So, what we did to onboard the account and set everything up. And this started with the SAP Business Network. So that was a massive help, transforming fragmented supply chains into unified and intelligent networks, if I can borrow their own tagline. But essentially it meant that it was much, much easier then to connect all of the different entities. So Prenax, Schweitzer, and SAP, not just those 3, but all of the different entities in all the different countries and regions and so on. So quite a complicated picture. So this created a series of shortcuts which were invaluable. So looking at implementation, customers usually think that this starts and ends with tech, and that's not the case. So in terms of what we do, it's first and foremost it's service, and that forms the backbone of Prenax and also Schweitzer. So we started by appointing a global lead, someone to run the weekly implementation meetings, liaising with all the concerned parties, making sure that the needle keep moving forward. We then appointed a dedicated customer service executive in each country and region someone to liaise with the suppliers, the stakeholders, to arrange for training, to make sure that we understood the requirements set by SAP. Then came service, so that's tailoring and creating the process flows, making sure that we knew exactly where everything was going. And lastly, the tech. So setting up the accounts and, of course, integrating with e-procurement as well to create that punch-out system. This is the dashboard that integrates with SAP Ariba. It obviously integrates with other e-procurement systems as well. It also works perfectly well without. So in that case, we would automate the approval flows through the system. But essentially what it does is it gives SAP access to the catalog so that they can raise orders through SAP Ariba. It also tells SAP if those resources are already in the system. So if somebody's already has a subscription, the system will tell SAP that to avoid duplications. It manages the approval routines. So one of the benefits is it stops all auto-renewals, making it much easier to avoid costs. It manages the active orders, so SAP can log in. Everything's in one place. They can change cost centers. They can make cancellations nice and easily. And of course, it gives them access to detailed reporting, so complete visibility of the spend. They also have access to eBook Central, and that basically means that they have a global inventory of books that they can source. They can preview those books for free, and once they've purchased that ebook, they can share it globally with anyone they want within the organization as well. So we can have a closer look at the implementation process now. So as I said, we allocate the right resources, the right people to do to take ownership of the project. We create the accounts, and then we get into comms. So usually comms takes place in two halves. The first comms sent by the customer, introducing Prenax, explaining the changes and the reasons why, and then we would follow up 1 or 2 weeks later to reinforce our position, to make sure they know who to talk to if they have questions, to offer training, and so on and so forth. Simultaneously, we integrate with SAP Ariba, and that project takes between 3 and 6 weeks, depending on UAT testing. But once that's done and we've gone live into production, we then create a bespoke user guide with screenshots of the SAP system. And that's really important because in some cases, SAP stakeholders may only place an order once a year, in which case they're having to relearn how to use the system every time. And then we provide training, and that's it, we're ready to go. That's all fairly routine and fairly quick. Where things start to differ from customer to customer is the data capture. And of course, this is where things get a bit more difficult for the customer because there is no visibility of spend there. So they might have hundreds of thousands of pounds or millions in some instances of spend that they simply cannot see because it's below that threshold. The way that we manage this is, I mean, there are lots of different ways of trying to capture that spend, but the way that we're able to do this efficiently and very quickly is by mandating the spend. It has to be mandated to be able to guarantee that we capture all of it, and that is the goal of the project. The alternative is that you give stakeholders freedom of choice, and the result is that you'll end up with duplications, the account won't be implemented properly, and sometimes procurement then needs to be more involved in data farming, which is a very slow, boring task and often ends in failure as well. So as long as that mandate is in place, then everything else, well, everything falls into place quite nicely. So that basically what we do is new orders can be placed immediately through SAP Ariba. Renewals that are active orders, as soon as they approach the expiry date, because the supplies are switched off, the end users have to volunteer that information or that renewal notice to the procurement department or to Prenax and Schweitzer. And at that point, we then place those orders on the SAP system so they can be approved. So there's no data farming needed. At the end of the 12-month period, we have a complete list. We have clarity of all of the spend. So it's much, much simpler and much easier for SAP, but also for ourselves as well. In terms of providing global service, we had to integrate our six hubs with SAP Ariba. So this started with Germany, so via Schweitzer, the German markets. But then the UK, the US or the Americas, APAC, where we have Japanese, Cantonese, Mandarin speakers, Southern Europe, so our offices are in Spain, France, Belgium and Holland, and then the Nordics. And essentially through that network of 6 hubs, we're able to provide that global connectivity and process efficiencies. So here we can see how SAP really benefited from that streamlining, that digital transformation, with the universe of SAP employees on the right-hand side and all of their suppliers on the left, and everything streamlined through Schweitzer, Prenax, and SAP Ariba in the middle. So the system intuitively knows where to direct those orders depending on where they are within the organization. So a much easier process and standardized right across the organization. In terms of process of placing orders, it's also very simple because the employees are already logged into the SAP Ariba system when they log in the morning. Once they press on that button for Prenax, it logs them straight into our system, which is the punch-out catalog, and then they decide what they want to buy, what they want to renew, and at that point it takes them back through to SAP Ariba, where it follows the approval routines on the SAP side, and then the purchase order is then generated and punched out through to Prenax. And of course then we fulfill the order, and the invoice is then sent back through to SAP Ariba in that way as well, so completely streamlined. It's easy to forget, having looked at the process flows just now, that a lot of this is service-based. A lot of the admin that a customer would need to do normally in managing the suppliers is then taken over by ourselves, but that work doesn't go away. So that's why we call ourselves a service provider rather than software or tech. But in this process flow, you can see in yellow at the top everything that the customer does, everything that we do underneath in blue. So this is quite a good example because this is for a renewal for a multi-user license, and the process starts 4 months prior to the expiry of that product, or it could be a corporate membership maybe. But then what we do is we obtain all the information we need from the supplier, so that could be the price range, the list of active users, the usage statistics, the changes in terms and conditions, so whatever we're asked to get by the customer. We then make that available to SAP, and in some instances we have to canvass all of the individual end users, and there could be hundreds, so we have a process for doing that. And at the end of that process, we then have a confirmed price, confirmed list of active users. We go back to SAP to make sure that they're happy to confirm that, and then that order is then placed on SAP Ariba so that the order can be placed through the e-procurement system. And at that point, then the rest of the process is the same. We fulfill the order and the invoice goes back through. So the idea is that we take on all of that admin so that SAP can forget about it and carry on with everything else that they need to do. And we can now talk about the so what of the project. What does it mean for SAP? And the results are split in two. We have, first of all, the process efficiency. So that visibility and that control means that a lot of time is saved, not just for procurement, but also for accounts payable. There's one global contract replacing hundreds. Better customer experience for the end users who know exactly where to go to do what. Central oversight, fewer payments, fewer invoices, fewer expense claims. Integrated procurement systems, much better, easier reporting because everything is in one place. Automated processes. And what this means is that procurement is then more agile and more efficient. And it means that they have more time to spend managing the much larger suppliers, which are much more business critical than one tail-end supplier. And of course, linked to process efficiencies is the print to digital. In this instance, this was a big KPI for SAP, and obviously something that we're continuously doing, but I think over the last 5 years, we've converted 3,000 tons of print to digital, so quite a positive picture, I think, there for them as well. And then the second half of the results, I suppose you could say, is the savings. So we split savings into 3 separate categories. First of all, we have the hard cost savings. So the fact that we have approval flows and standardized processes means that there's no rogue spend. Everything has to be approved. If it's not approved, it just doesn't happen. We don't fulfill the order. We have fewer duplications. We consolidate individual orders together to create multi-user licenses wherever possible because they're easier to manage but also more cost effective. We push back on price increases automatically, and we put a stop to auto renewals. We then focus on cost avoidance. So the fact that everything is in one place makes it nice and easy for unwanted resources to be cancelled and refunded pro rata, or for resources to be denied at the end of the renewal cycle. And we monitor joiners and leavers. So if somebody leaves SAP, we flag up those resources so that they can be stopped immediately or reallocated to other individuals to avoid additional costs later on down the line. And then the operational savings, which are also just as important, is all about the fact that there are fewer suppliers, fewer payments, a lot of time saved. So for example, not having to onboard new suppliers, which in some cases could take 6 weeks in some organizations, for a small supplier just doesn't make any sense at all. So all of that goes away, making life a lot simpler. And the values obviously differ for this, depending on the cost of processing a PO, the cost of processing an invoice. But if we understand what those are, then we can run those calculations for the customer at the end of each year and provide a report on that as well. So obviously I can't really talk too much about numbers relating to SAP's account for obvious reasons. So we've just put together some examples for some of the other customers to provide a bit of context. Starting with a pharmaceutical company in Europe, actually a customer of Schweitzer. The account started with just 10,000 euros of spend, and following a period of time, I think about a year, that the spend actually reached almost 4 million euros. And that's just by capturing all of it, putting a mandate in place. So I think they had a bit of a scare. But the good thing is once that spend is captured, it can then be reduced, which is obviously the important point here. A European FMCG company accurately predicted their spend at 800,000 euros because they were managing it beforehand. We're obviously centralizing that spend and providing the efficiencies, and the account is going from being domestic to global, and that's where the real efficiencies come into play as well. If everything can be consolidated globally, the more we manage, the more we can reduce. Similar here, a global manufacturer who thought their spend was 350,000. In fact, after a year, the spend captured was 1 million. So again, we were able to reduce that. And in this instance, we had a procurement department who exaggerated the size of their spend in order to get better pricing. So in actual fact, the actual spend was less than predicted. But we're now going from a regional account to a global account, meaning that the potential is increasing again. And last year, when I was here in September, I listened to quite a few presenters talking about procurement not being about cost saving anymore. And I think that's true, but obviously savings and cost cutting does still play an important role. So here we have an example of a UK customer who tried to do an audit of their own spend and had some problems, so they appointed us to do that for them. They estimated their spend was about £150,000. At the end of the 12-month period, we realized, after having switched off the supplies and onboarding everything, that the spend was reaching close to 5 million. So obviously a massive difference there. And then when we met with the customer, they set a target for us to reduce that spend by 1.1 million, which we were able to outperform by just over £500,000. So a really big win there. And I think that's a good representation of what we see with a lot of organizations. So 174 suppliers consolidated to one, almost 700 invoices streamlined and consolidated as well. So that provides a snapshot, really, I suppose. But that was the project. I suppose the big win for SAP is that we're able to generate these efficiencies and streamline those processes and standardize those processes without them needing to be involved too much on a day-to-day basis. So not draining their time and distracting them from other projects. So that's it. Thank you very much.
That was hugely interesting. Thank you so much, Shibi. I've got a few questions, as usual. Anything from the floor? No worries. At the end of the day, I think people want to go network, which is fair enough.
Everyone's tired.
Yeah, but that was really interesting. I just wonder how small an enterprise could use it, because it almost looks like a SaaS for small business or for new businesses. Is there an application that works that way?
Yeah, well, we have some customers that are very, very small indeed, that spend just a few £1,000s, and then we have other customers who centralize everything and where the spend goes into the millions. So there's no right or wrong, really. It depends on what their priorities are.
So even if your revenue was like 100 to 500K, that's incredible. I almost never hear of that.
No.
How did SAP manage subscriptions and memberships before you came aboard?
Yeah, so I think it was quite fragmented. So they had some countries using another provider, but that provider wasn't global, so that there were limitations there. And then you had other entities that were literally doing things directly with suppliers. So it was, I think, quite difficult to have that digital transformation. So yeah, just everybody doing things in a different way.
You mentioned a trend early on that started 5 years ago. What started that shift?
Yes, good question. I think possibly the biggest change is that if you go back far enough, so for example, back in the early 90s when we started, most subscriptions were print-based. And back in the day, it wouldn't have been procurement looking after that spend. It would have been probably a facilities department or maybe a library. And what's happened in the last decade is that everything is now going digital, and not just digital, but much larger products as well. So multi-user licenses, much more complex to manage. And I think now procurement are getting more involved, and e-procurement, of course, is fitting into that picture. And so there's a real drive, a real desire to have everything consolidated globally and digitally as well. And I suppose that's sort of quite convenient for us to sort of fit into that picture as well.
You described, how you completed this project. You took it through the stages from the beginning to the end. How many people are involved? I was trying to picture, is that like 30 people or is that up 200?
Yeah, so specifically just for SAP?
Yeah, just as a case study, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, SAP, so we've allocated probably about 15 people globally on the accounts, and that's everything from managing the individual suppliers to liaising with the stakeholders and everything in the background as well, finance and so on. So that's, yeah.
And are you bouncing across their different departments, or are you interacting with a lot of the same people?
So it depends. So although everything's standardized, we'll find that each country has a slightly different way of doing things. So in some cases, we're interacting more with the individual stakeholders, and in others, we have a centralized point of contact that does that work for us, and we simply report back to them. So yeah, and there's no right or wrong. You know, we have some customers who do one thing and then another. So yeah.
Unbelievable. We'll leave it there for the day, and will we see you here tomorrow?
Yes, absolutely.
Outstanding. Thank you all for your attention today. Thank you, JP.